Hi, my name is David Detman. I live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I'm making this video to highlight ongoing human rights violations that are occurring in Xinjiang, far northwest China. I'm speaking as someone who knows people who have been disappeared there, and I know several people here in the States that have missing family there. And I was also I visited there relatively recently in March of 2018. I talked about some of my initial shocks upon arrival there in 2018 in a previous video, and you can hear that if you're interested to hear me talk about that. You can find that under video number 107. This time I want to talk a bit more about my observations and experiences there, um, and just kind of plea that people respect local cultures around the world and take notice of things like this when they're happening. Um, in my prior video, I talked about how difficult it was. I'm someone who really enjoys cultural tourism, being completely immersed in a culture and enjoying language, music, foods. I'm particularly interested in food and drink culture, and I've long been interested in Uyghur food and drink culture. So I returned there in March of 2018 to have this experience, to try to be surrounded by Uyghur culture and learn as much as possible about cooking in particular and food. And I found it very challenging, much different from previous trips. And I mentioned that part of that was because people were afraid to talk to me after I was identified as a clear foreigner, that it seemed that they would be getting in trouble, or certain trouble, that so that they would kind of turn away or look away when possible and not really engage in conversation. Um, but beyond that, even more shocking, and this is something that was very obvious that I should have mentioned in the previous video, but I didn't really dwell on it. There were just a lot fewer Uyghurs around, and I lived in Kashgar. When I was in Kashgar, I lived next to the old neighborhood of the old city of Kashgar, and that was a predominantly Uyghur neighborhood. And there are lots of Uyghur-run businesses, restaurants, shops, things like that, that are shuttered and closed and abandoned. There were also households in the neighborhood, several households that had padlocks on the outside that were just like, where do people go? I don't know. Um, I traveled to other parts of southern Xinjiang. I took a day trip to try to go to Atush. That's a nearby city to Kashgar. Um, and I had troubles with that whole, that was a disaster of a trip. I hailed a taxi. The city is so close by to Kashgar that you can get there in probably half an hour, about half an hour, 25 minutes, something like that. So I got a taxi, and I had a Uyghur driver, and I asked him if he would take me to Atush, and he was kind of like hesitant, but he's like, okay, I will. So he did. So we drove for 25 minutes or however long that is, and got to a surprising thing. I didn't realize that cities in Xinjiang they're now kind of blockaded around the outskirts of the city, and you have to get out of the vehicles and show your papers, show your reasonings for travel, and then you can be allowed into the city. In my case, I had a passport, and I'm a tourist, and I was taken aside for questioning. Um, that was a very interesting experience. They were suspicious of my reasons for being there. It's not known to be a touristy area, Atush. Um, but I knew it as a place. It's a seat for the Kyrgyz um, autonomous county, and I thought maybe there might be some interesting things to see that relate to that. Like maybe there's a representation of Kyrgyz that I could see, like a restaurant or something. I was explaining this all to them as well. I'm very interested in food culture. Um, it didn't take long. We were getting along really well. The guards, the Han Chinese guards and the Uyghur guards. It was we were. I started to get kind of the questions like, does everyone have a gun in the U.S., and like asking me all sorts of questions about life in America, kinds of things that I used to hear when I was teaching English back in Guangzhou in the 90s. Um, Basically, we're making friends and things are going well. And And then I realized that in the room next to us, my taxi driver is being berated. Um, he has his documents out, and people are yelling at him. His face has turned beet red. His eyes are tearing up, and he's clearly under a lot of pressure. And then I realized that my uh, my simple interest in visiting the city has gotten him into a lot of trouble. Apparently, he's not. I mean, he should not have been allowed to bring a foreigner to this place, and now he's in trouble because of that. Um, like many places in Xinjiang, nobody knows the rules. I mean, like a lot of people, even the guards don't often know the rules. Like, what do you do when a foreigner happens to come through and they're supposed to show their Chinese identification card? Well, they don't have one, but a lot of people don't know what to do. These situations are pretty common, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a very privileged white American tourist, so I do feel protected in a sense, but he is definitely not protected. Fortunately and unfortunately, what happened then was they received an order from an administrator saying, you shouldn't let this guy go because we don't know what he's doing there. And the person in charge of that unit was really apologetic, and he was like, oh, wow, he's like really sorry that he couldn't let me go. But he allowed me to leave with my taxi driver to go back to Kashgar. So in the end, my taxi driver was released, and we were able to go back to Kashgar. I tried to continue to engage with my taxi driver in conversation, but he was so shaken up by the experience, and he was didn't want to talk anymore. That was a heartbreaking episode, and it was something very. I mean, it was just I just took a taxi somewhere, and this is so. Where in terms of where did all the people go? A lot of people were recalled back to their hometowns. So you can imagine in this highly controlled means of travel, where you have to be showing your papers and you have to have approval to be traveling to different places. It's not possible for people to just go back to Kashgar if they were working there, for example. I imagine that a lot of the restaurants, the big restaurants in the old city of Kashgar, they probably were run by village people, probably from around Kashgar, from other places, like Atush, for example. And people aren't given permission to travel and live in Kashgar right now because of the this very military um, situation that's happening. I mean, this total control of all movement in that region. I then traveled to Hotan after that, and Hotan was also very depressing. I had never been to Hotan before, so I didn't know what to expect. But I always thought of Hotan as being the other great Uyghur city in southern Xinjiang, like a large-scale Uyghur city. I expected there to be the same kinds of cultural centers, like an old city neighborhood, for example. And I felt, this is going to sound really strange, but I felt like I could not find the Uyghur neighborhood in Hotan. like it's clear that there's been a large scale redistribution of people in the city, and the downtown area where I ended up staying, unfortunately for me, was very China centric. So I mean everything's in Chinese, and there's no Uyghur. And actually, one night I walked for like 3 hours looking for a Uyghur restaurant to eat at, and I could not find one. I was clearly in the wrong neighborhood there, but I couldn't find the right neighborhood really. I mean, there were a handful of really interesting places in the city, but I needed a guide. That's what it comes down to. You might be asking, like, why didn't you just get a tour? Why didn't you just get a guide? In my experience, from very horrible experiences in the past, taking tours in China, my most positive experiences were seeing life from a local's perspective, and that's really what I wanted. And actually, I did try to take a tour. While I was in Kashgar, my hotel was right next to the CITS, that's the state-run Chinese tourist agency, and I tried to buy a tour, and they were not selling tours at that time. They said we're not doing any activities right now. And the same was true for the private tour companies, the Uyghur-run private tour companies. They said we're not doing any activities right now. So there must have been some sort of a hold on those sorts of things. So I hope I've given you some some more ideas about how constrictive life is there. And again, I'm speaking from the perspective of a very privileged white American tourist, and locals there, local Uyghurs, have a much harder time, as you might imagine. I did talk to people who actually attend daytime education center trainings, and I did have a few limited conversations with people, but it was very limited in terms of who I could talk to and what I could learn. It may interest some of you. I have a food blog in Philadelphia, and I did dedicate one post to reflections on traveling around Kashgar and Hotan, and you can find that on my blog. It's called Asian Markets of Philadelphia, and you can see some pictures of some closed restaurants and some interesting signage that will give you more of a sense of the troubles there. One example that I found kind of humorous. The Xinhua Shudian is like a state-run bookstore in China, and right now the biggest publications in Kashgar are communist writings, like communist texts and Xi Jinping thought, and these are like on these huge displays, and there's not much else being published. In terms of Uyghur language materials, very few things are being published. I couldn't find anything newer than 2016. But even at the Xinhua Shudian, this communist kind of bookstore, they were closed half of the day because the staff had to attend re-education sessions, and they had a sign in the window saying that. You can see that on my blog. These are they're reminiscent of struggle sessions, right? I mean, like, everyone's obligated to go and to praise their allegiance to the party and everything, and learn Chinese. There's a huge focus on learning Chinese, and a lot of people who are sent to these programs know Chinese already. But so please take interest in local cultures. A lot of Chinese friends may be turning a blind eye to this right now, and I see where they're coming from, as coming from a place that's so messed up in terms of race relations as we are here in the States. As you may know, you might not know, in this country, in North America, and in the United States of America, the native populations were all but eliminated. There were forced relocations, a huge march that forced people to be based on reservations. And then after that, in a place not very far from where I live now, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, there was a flagship Indian industrial school where they took children from parents and cut them off from their families and their cultures, and they were sent to these camps to be trained in Anglo-Christian values and to grow up as like a modern American, right? This is exactly the same kind of stuff that's happening in Xinjiang right now. I mean, I see this as a very dark thing in our history, in American history, and this seems to be the same direction that they're trying to move in Xinjiang in terms of cultural transformation and trying to get people to be cut off from their families and their culture and their language, and sacrifice that for the new China. This is a very disturbing thing for me in my mind. A lot of Uyghur emigre, a lot of refugees here in the U.S. Are calling this a genocide, which is a very sensitive word in the U.S. But it's definitely, there's an eradication of culture that's underway, and I hope you take notice and take interest. Thank you for listening.